Well, thank you very much for asking me to talk on my book, The Secret of Everlasting Life, published by Singing Dragon. This is a book which has had a very long gestation, and it's only really now, 22 years later, after it was written, that it's coming to fruition. Interesting that a thing has to wait for the time, isn't it? You've probably all read Hamlet. Right, ripeness is all, is what he says. This is, reminds me of the first time I met my teacher. I have to refer back to Gia-fu Feng because he's the Chinese American who I met back in the 70s. And it's through him that I got intimate with the Chinese culture, really found it a touchstone for my own development. I was about 24, 25, living in London. It was in the days of human potential movement, encounter groups, Gestalt therapy, Tai Chi. Tai Chi was just arriving, Tai Chi Chuan, 1970, 1971. There were a few select bands doing Tai Chi down in attics and sports centres. And I can remember, this is quite an interesting story, I can remember going to my first Tai Chi class. Probably a lot of you practice Tai Chi and Qigong, and you probably think it's quite an ordinary practice, but it's not an ordinary practice, it's actually quite an extraordinary practice. And in the basement room there were these people doing this, and it didn't look like very much at all. You probably know. And in Qigong, it's even worse because you stand like this, even less. So how do you solve a conundrum like that? How can something which is so powerful look so insignificant? Now, that's a question we have to think about. The answer, of course, is that it's happening internally. And the Chinese world, the whole Eastern world, is much more developed in the language and the research they've done individually on the internal world or on the external world. So obviously Western civilization, the dominance of the West of the last 500 years, is its manipulation and ability to profit through the external world. It's not too much to say that the genius of the East is its ability to profit through the internal world and through understanding the processes of internal transformation. I think that we probably got locked into what we might call the middle zone in Northern Europe. The kind of academic discussion, the kind of hair splitting that goes on in academics to sort out exactly what it is that we're trying to describe or express. In China and in the East, in India and associated countries, they seem to go through that middle zone deeper somehow, perhaps because they were more in touch with their natural environment, perhaps because they didn't have that conglomeration of cities or mercantile trading tradition. In fact, Confucians despised merchants. They thought that if you were interested in profit from what you were doing, that was definitely not a no-no. It's very different to nowadays. They're interested in the quality of the action, not the quantity. So that in the East, they developed a much more articulate, symbolic language for describing the internal world. This is where we come down to alchemy. So seeing all these people doing this very slow practice, ultimately you come in touch with what we might call that process of internal transformation, which has been called a spiritual path in the past, it's called. And religions have encapsulated it and given it names and an authoritative approach and a disciple-master approach. But all we're talking about is the development of the individual as a person through their life into some kind of spiritual growth. This is a very interesting text because, have you got this book here? Because it's the earliest recorded text on alchemical transformation that talks about an elixir, something internal, not an elixir you drink, but an elixir which you cultivate within yourself, like an internal medicine which you cultivate through breath control, which you're then able to use to give oneself perhaps a peek into eternity or a peek into immortality. That's all one could ask for, perhaps. Now, talking here definitely reminds me of the first time I met J Fu Feng. He was a Chinese gentleman born in Shanghai in 1919, came to the States in 1949, just before the communist takeover, and then spent the next 30 years in America. So he was very much half East, half West. He travelled to California and met Fritz Perls, Alan Watts and such like, interesting, influential Californians, and devised his own brand of Taoism for the modern day, very much rooted in the tradition, but accessible to young people, really. He spent a lot of time teaching over the 10 years I knew him. Hundreds of people went through his community, which he called Still Point, which was then in Manitou Springs in Colorado. We used to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, 3:30, 4 o'clock if you're lucky, and sit for perhaps 2 or 3, 4 hours. Then there'd be breakfast and then tasks and jobs, and about midday we'd disperse and go off walking in the hills and come back in the evening, go to bed early and get up again the next day. So it was a bit of an ashram. We would be doing Tai Chi, we'd be talking about Taoist ideals, and we'd be interacting as a community. Because he was rooted in the human potential movement. His idea really was that it's through this transformative process of encounter that we can learn a lot more about ourselves. And yet he called the community Still Point, which is a translation of the Chinese words. Literally, they mean settled heart. And if we want to talk about quietism, we ought to talk about quietism, because of the three main influences on this book, the first was the Taoist tradition of hermetic retreat. The contemplative life. Do you know about the contemplative life? In the medieval times, we talked about hermits, and there was the idea of there was an active life and a contemplative life, and you could get to heaven in two ways, either through being active in the world and doing good works, or through being contemplative and retreating away up into the hills or up into a little cell. Some people were actually walled up in cells for 30, 40 years, and that way they could come closer to God. So, that's in the Christian tradition. The tradition also existed in China, the idea of the hermit sitting in the hills and bettering himself and all society through his actions.